Sometimes we condemn what we don't understand. In the town of Dust Creek, a wild stallion named Diablo has broken bones and shattered pride across the county. Every rancher who tried to tame him ended up in the dirt, nursing injuries. Now the town has gathered to watch the sheriff execute the beast. But when a quiet drifter named Silas steps into that corral, he sees what everyone else missed. What he discovers will shame every man in that crowd and prove that cruelty often wears the mask of fear and ignorance. The horse isn't vicious, he's terrified. And the truth will leave the town speechless. What could turn a killer horse into a gentle ride in minutes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887 was a place where a man's worth was measured by his word and the strength of his handshake. Dust Creek sat in a shallow valley where the land stretched flat and endless in three directions, broken only by the distant purple smudge of mountains to the east. The town itself was modest, 24 buildings clustered along a single main street, their weathered wood facades bleached pale by relentless sun. Dust hung in the air like a living thing, kicked up by wagon wheels and horse hooves, settling on everything with a fine grit that no amount of sweeping could conquer. This was cattle country, but it was also horse country. The army post at Fort Bridger, 40 miles north, needed a steady supply of mounts, and Dust Creek had built its modest prosperity on breaking wild mustangs and training cavalry horses. The Webb Ranch, sprawling across 2,000 acres of scrub and grassland just beyond town, was the largest operation in the county. Cyrus Webb had made his fortune supplying horses to the army, and he ruled his domain with the confidence of a man who had never known failure until 3 years ago, when he purchased what he believed would be the finest stallion he had ever owned. The horse arrived from Mexico with papers claiming Spanish bloodlines and a temperament suited for breeding. What arrived was a magnificent animal, certainly nearly 17 hands high, coal black except for a white blaze down his face, with a chest like a barrel and legs that suggested both power and speed. But temperament? That was another matter entirely. The first wrangler who tried to saddle the horse ended up with a broken collarbone. The second suffered 3 cracked ribs and a concussion that left him speaking nonsense for 2 days. By the time the 6th man was thrown, this one breaking his leg in 2 places, when the horse kicked him against the corral fence, the animal had earned his name, Diablo, the devil. Cyrus Webb was not a man who admitted defeat easily. He brought in specialists from as far as California, offering good money to anyone who could break the black stallion. They all failed. Some failed spectacularly, requiring Doc Henley's ministrations for weeks afterward. One man, a renowned horsebreaker from Texas, took one look at Diablo and refused to enter the corral, claiming the horse had murder in his eyes. The legend grew. Stories spread through the territory of the killer horse that could not be tamed. Men whispered that the animal was possessed, that he had somehow absorbed the malevolence of his Mexican homeland's harshest deserts. Others claimed Webb had been cheated, sold a horse that had already killed men before arriving in Arizona. The truth became irrelevant. What mattered was that Diablo had become a symbol of something wild and dangerous that refused to bend to human will. 3 years passed. The horse remained in a specially reinforced corral at the Webb Ranch, fed and watered but otherwise left alone. Cyrus Webb absorbed the financial loss, the cost of the horse, the medical bills, the wasted time, but the wound to his pride festered. Every time he looked at that magnificent animal, he saw his own failure staring back at him. Last month, he had finally made his decision. The horse would be destroyed. Sheriff Tom Brennan agreed it was a public safety matter, he said, and besides, no animal that had hurt that many men deserved to live. Doc Henley protested weakly, suggesting the horse be released into the wild instead, but he was overruled. Cyrus Webb wanted the execution public, wanted the whole town to witness the end of the beast that had humbled him. That was the situation when Silas arrived in Dust Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before the scheduled execution. He rode in on a roan mare that had seen better years, leading a pack mule that carried his worldly possessions in a worn leather saddlebag. The saddlebag was the kind that told a story cracked and sun-faded, but well-maintained, with repairs stitched in different-colored thread spanning years of use. It hung heavy, but not over-full, suggesting a man who travelled light because he had learned what truly mattered. Inside were the essentials: a spare shirt, a few personal items wrapped in oilcloth, a tintype photograph he never showed anyone, and a book of Emerson essays with pages soft from repeated reading. Silas himself was unremarkable at first glance, somewhere in his late 50s, lean but not gaunt, with grey streaking through his dark hair and a weathered face that suggested long years spent outdoors. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots resoled more than once. He wore no gun, which was unusual enough in itself. His eyes were what stayed with people after meeting him: quiet, observant, carrying a depth that suggested he had seen things he preferred not to discuss. He took a room at Martha Keene's boarding house, paying a week in advance with coins counted carefully from a leather purse. Martha, a widow who had run the establishment for 15 years since her husband's death, was accustomed to reading men quickly. This one, she decided, was decent, respectful without being obsequious, quiet without being sullen. "Just passing through?" she asked, as she showed him to a clean but spare room on the second floor. "That depends," Silas replied, his voice carrying a slight rasp as if from disuse. "If there's work, I might stay a while. If not, I'll move on." "What kind of work?" "Most anything. I know horses, I know carpentry, I know how to keep accounts if someone needs bookwork done." Martha nodded. "Talk to Samuel at the livery. He was saying yesterday his back's been troubling him. Might could use someone to help with the stalls and such." And so Silas found work, simple labour that paid enough for his room and meals with a little left over. He mucked out stalls, repaired tack, and helped shoe horses when Samuel's arthritis made gripping the tools difficult. He worked steadily, without complaint, and spoke little beyond what was necessary. But he watched. He heard the talk about Diablo. How could he not? It was the primary topic of conversation in Dust Creek that week. The execution was scheduled for Saturday morning, and anticipation built like distant thunder. Some folks, mostly the ranchers and their hands, spoke of it with satisfaction, about time that Devil Horse got what was coming. Others, fewer in number, expressed quiet misgivings. Billy, the young stable hand at the Webb Ranch, was one of those. He was 17, gangly and earnest, with a shock of red hair and a spray of freckles across his nose. He came into town Thursday afternoon to pick up supplies and ended up at the livery while Silas was working. "You hear about the horse they're fixing to shoot on Saturday?" Billy asked, leaning against the stall gate as Silas forked fresh hay. "I've heard talk," Silas replied evenly. "It ain't right," Billy said, and there was anger in his young voice. "That horse never had a fair chance. Every man who tried to break him came at him rough, treating him like he was already mean. You treat something like it's dangerous long enough, maybe it becomes dangerous." Silas paused in his work, straightening to look at the boy. "You've been around this horse?" "I feed him. Have been for 2 years now. Mr. Webb don't hardly go near the corral anymore, so it falls to me." Billy's voice dropped. "That horse ain't evil. I've watched him. There's something wrong, something that makes him scared. But nobody listens to me. I'm just the stable boy." "What do you think is wrong?" Billy shook his head. "I don't know exactly. But I've noticed he always seems worse when people come at him from his left side. Rears up, strikes out, but if you're on his right, bringing feed or water, he's calmer, still nervous, but calmer." Silas filed this information away, his expression thoughtful. "You told anyone this?" "Told Mr. Webb. He said I was making excuses for a killer horse." Billy's shoulders slumped. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just a fool kid who doesn't know anything." "Observation is never foolish," Silas said quietly. especially when it comes from spending time with something, watching its patterns. That conversation stayed with Silas through Thursday evening and into Friday. He found himself thinking about a horse he had never seen, wondering about a young man's observations and why no one had thought them worth investigating. Friday afternoon, he walked out to the Webb Ranch. It was not far, 20 minutes on foot, and the day was cooling as shadows lengthened. The ranch house was substantial, 2 stories of whitewashed adobe with a wide porch facing west. Behind it sprawled the outbuildings, bunkhouse, barn, multiple corrals. The corral where they kept Diablo was separate from the others, built with extra high rails and reinforced posts. Silas stood outside it for a long time, watching the black stallion that paced along the far side. Even from a distance, the horse was impressive, powerful, alert, his coat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. But there was something in the way he moved, something in his constant vigilance that spoke not of viciousness but of fear. "You, the stranger staying at Martha's place," the voice came from behind him. Silas turned to find Cyrus Webb approaching, a man in his mid-40s, thick through the middle, with a florid face and eyes that assessed everyone as either useful or in the way. "I am," Silas replied. "Name's Silas Thorne. Cyrus Webb. This is my land." It was not said threateningly, merely as a statement of fact. "You here to gawk at the devil horse before we put him down tomorrow?" "Just curious," Silas said. "Heard a lot of talk about him in town." "Well, tomorrow the talk ends. Should have done this 2 years ago, but I kept thinking maybe one more try, one more expert." Webb's jaw tightened. "Cost me a fortune in medical bills and lost opportunities. That horse has Spanish bloodlines. He could have been worth thousands as a stud. Instead, he's nothing but a danger. Has anyone considered there might be something wrong with him? Some injury or ailment that makes him react the way he does?" Webb's expression hardened. "I've had vets look at him from a distance, can't get close enough for a proper examination. He tries to kill anyone who comes near. Far as they can tell, he's perfectly sound in body. It's his mind that's twisted." He looked at Silas with sudden suspicion. "You some kind of horse whisperer? Because I've had 3 of those come through, and all 3 left, with their tails between their legs." "No, sir," Silas replied calmly. "Just a man who's worked with horses most of his life. Sometimes they surprise you, is all." Webb grunted. "Well, there'll be no more surprises from this one. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, Sheriff Brennan will put a bullet in his brain, and that'll be the end of it." He turned to go, then paused. "You're welcome to watch if you want. Whole town's invited. Going to make it a public thing, let folks see that even something that seems invincible can be brought low when it needs to be." Silas said nothing, watching as Webb strode back toward his house. Then he returned his attention to the corral, to the horse that continued his restless pacing, always keeping his right side toward the fence, his left toward the open center of the enclosure. The sun was setting when Silas finally turned back toward town, the leather saddlebag over his shoulder, holding everything he owned. In his mind, he was already making calculations, already seeing patterns that others had missed. And in his heart, which had been quiet for so many years, something stirred, a sense of purpose he had not felt in a very long time. Tomorrow morning would bring either justice or tragedy. Silas had not yet decided which, but he knew one thing with certainty. He would not stand by and watch a creature be destroyed without at least trying to understand the truth. Saturday morning arrived with a sky so clear and blue it seemed impossible that anything dark could happen beneath it. Silas rose before dawn, as was his habit, and sat by the window of his room watching the town wake up. Martha had left coffee on the stove, and he drank it slowly, feeling the weight of the decision he had made sometime in the night hours. By 8 o'clock, people were already heading toward the Webb Ranch. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons, families with children, old-timers who remembered when Dust Creek was just a trading post, young men eager for spectacle. There was a festival atmosphere to it all, which troubled Silas more than he cared to admit. This was not a celebration. This was an execution. And the fact that so many treated it as entertainment spoke to something he had seen too many times in his life: the ease with which people could convince themselves that violence was justified, even righteous, when directed at something they feared or did not understand. He walked out to the ranch at 8:30, his worn leather saddlebag left behind in his room. He carried nothing but himself and his resolve. The crowd had gathered around the reinforced corral where Diablo was kept. Someone had set up benches for the older folks and the ladies, and there was even a vendor selling lemonade, as if this were a county fair. Children ran between the adults, their voices high with excitement. Sheriff Brennan stood near the corral gate, his rifle already in hand, a Winchester repeater with a walnut stock that gleamed from careful maintenance. The loading gate was open, and Silas could see the brass of cartridges loaded into the magazine tube. The sheriff's face was set in grim lines, but there was something else there too, a kind of pride in being the one chosen to carry out this task. Cyrus Webb stood on a makeshift platform, addressing the crowd, his voice carried across the morning air, practiced and confident. "Folks, I appreciate you all coming out this morning. I know it's not a pleasant thing we're about to do, but it's a necessary thing. That horse you see in there has injured 12 good men, some of them permanently. We've tried everything, the best horse breakers, the most patient trainers, even folks who claim to have special ways with animals. Nothing has worked. Some creatures are born wrong, born with something twisted inside them, and no amount of trying will fix it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Silas moved slowly through the gathered people, working his way closer to the corral. He could see Diablo now, pressed against the far side, his head high, his whole body tense. The horse's eyes were wide, white showing around the edges, and foam flecked his chest, where he had been sweating despite the cool morning air. "Now, I want everyone to stay well back from the fence," Webb continued. "Sheriff Brennan is going to do what needs doing, quick and clean. The horse won't suffer. And then we can all move on from this chapter and remember it as a lesson learned that some things, no matter how fine they look on the outside, are too dangerous to keep around." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, working the lever action on his rifle to chamber a round. The metallic click-clack carried in the silence that had fallen over the crowd. He positioned himself at the gate, raising the rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at the horse that stood trembling on the far side of the corral. That was when Silas stepped through the crowd and placed his hand on the corral gate. "Hold on," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clear in the morning air. Every head turned. Sheriff Brennan lowered his rifle slightly, confusion crossing his face. Cyrus Webb's expression darkened. "Who the hell are you?" Webb demanded. "My name is Silas Thorne. I'm the fellow staying at Martha Keene's place, working at the livery." Silas kept his voice even, respectful. "I'd like to ask for a few minutes with this horse before you carry out the sentence." "The sentence?" Webb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't a courtroom, mister. This is my property, and that's my horse, and I've decided he needs to be put down. Now step away from that gate before I have the sheriff remove you." "I will," Silas said. "Just hear me out first. That young man who works for you, Billy, he's been watching this horse for 2 years. He's noticed something important, something nobody else seems to have paid attention to. Billy's a stable boy," Webb said dismissively. "He's got no education, no experience with problem horses." "He's got eyes," Silas replied, "and he's got patience. He's noticed that this horse reacts different depending on which side you approach from. Always worse on the left, calmer on the right. That tells me something might be wrong, something physical that makes him panic when he can't see what's coming." Doc Henley, who had been standing near the back of the crowd, pushed forward. He was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that had set more bones than he cared to count. "Cyrus, it wouldn't hurt to let the man try," Doc said. "I've been saying all along we should look for a medical cause before we resort to this." "You've been saying a lot of things, Doc, and I've listened to enough of them." Webb's face had gone red. This stranger shows up in town 3 days ago, and now he thinks he knows more about my horse than I do, than professional horsebreakers do. I don't claim to know more than anyone, Silas said. I just asked for the chance to look. 10 minutes. If I'm wrong, if the horse is as vicious as you say, then I'll step aside and the sheriff can do what needs doing. But if I'm right, if there's a reason for his behavior that can be addressed, then you'll have saved a valuable animal and spared yourself the guilt of killing something that didn't deserve to die. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the children had stopped their playing, sensing the tension. Martha Keene was there. Silas could see her near the benches, her hands clasped tight together. Billy stood off to one side, his young face torn between hope and fear. Sheriff Brennan looked from Silas to Webb and back again. "It's Cyrus's call," he said finally. "It's his horse." Webb stared at Silas for a long moment. His pride warred with something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the faint hope that he might recoup some value from this animal he had written off as a loss. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. 10 minutes, he said. "But the first sign that horse goes after you, we're putting him down immediately. I won't have another man's blood on my conscience over this animal." "Understood," Silas said. He looked at the sheriff. "I'll need you to lower that rifle and step well back. The horse is already terrified. The sight of a gun pointed at him won't help." Sheriff Brennan hesitated, then slowly lowered the Winchester. He stepped back from the gate, though his finger stayed near the trigger guard. Silas turned to face the corral, and for the first time since stepping forward, he felt the full weight of what he was about to do. The horse in that enclosure had hurt 12 men. Good men, experienced men, men who knew their way around horses. And here he was, preparing to enter that space with nothing but a theory and an old stable boy's observations. But he had learned long ago that sometimes the most important actions were the ones that frightened you most. Sometimes standing by was the real cowardice, and stepping forward even into danger was the only choice an honest man could make. He lifted the latch on the gate. The metal scraped against wood, loud in the silence. Every person in that crowd held their breath as Silas Thorne, a stranger with nothing but his convictions, stepped into the corral with the killer horse they called Diablo. The gate swung shut behind him with a sound like finality, and the morning suddenly felt much less certain than it had moments before. The first thing Silas noticed inside the corral was the smell. Not the expected odor of horse and manure, but fear. It hung in the air, sharp and acrid, the scent of an animal that had lived too long in a state of terror. Diablo stood at the far side of the enclosure, his body rigid, his head thrown high. The horse's nostrils flared wide, pulling in Silas's scent, trying to assess this new threat. Silas stood very still just inside the gate, making himself as small and unthreatening as possible. He did not look directly at the horse. Direct eye contact would be read as a challenge. Instead, he kept his gaze soft, peripheral, watching without staring. His hands hung loose at his sides, and he breathed slowly, deliberately, willing his own heartbeat to slow despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. The crowd outside the corral was a wall of faces, pressed close to the rails, watching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He could hear their breathing, the shuffle of feet, a child's whispered question quickly shushed. The weight of their expectation was almost physical, but he pushed it aside. Right now, there was only him and this horse, and the truth that lay between them, waiting to be discovered. "Easy now," Silas murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody's going to hurt you, not if I can help it." The horse's ears swiveled toward the sound, then immediately pinned back against his skull. His lips pulled back, showing teeth, and a low rumble came from his chest, not quite a whinny, more like a warning. Silas noted that the horse was angled with his right side toward the fence, his left toward the open center of the corral, just as Billy had described. That left side stayed back, guarded, as if the horse was protecting it. Silas took one small step forward, moving with excruciating slowness. Immediately, Diablo's head came up higher, and he shifted his weight onto his hindquarters, preparing to rear. Silas froze. 1 second passed. 2, 3. The horse did not strike, did not rear fully, but the threat was clear in every line of his body. "I see you," Silas said softly. "I see you're scared." He took another step, this time angling slightly to his right, the horse's right. The shift was subtle, but the effect was immediate. Diablo's ears came forward just a fraction, and some of the rigid tension left his shoulders. Not much, but enough to notice. Silas took another step, maintaining that angle, keeping himself in the horse's right field of vision. From outside the corral, he heard Cyrus Webb's voice, tight with tension. "He's going to get himself killed." "Quiet!" Martha Keene snapped back, surprising everyone. "Let the man work." Silas continued his slow approach, each step measured, each movement telegraphed well in advance. He talked as he moved, keeping his voice low and steady, the words mattering less than the tone. He spoke of weather and distance, of the morning sky and the smell of sage on the wind, anything to create a continuous, non-threatening sound that the horse could orient to. When he was halfway across the corral, Diablo suddenly wheeled away, trotting along the far fence. But he did not strike out, did not rear, and that was important. The horse was trying to escape, not attack, flight, not fight. Silas stopped moving and simply stood, letting Diablo circle, giving him space to calm. It was then, watching the horse move, that Silas saw it a subtle hitch in the way Diablo held his head, a fraction of a tilt that suggested he was compensating for something. The horse's left eye, when it turned toward Silas during the circling, showed something that might have been cloudiness, might have been scarring. At this distance, with the horse in motion, it was hard to be certain, but combined with Billy's observations, with the pattern of which side triggered panic, a picture was beginning to form. Silas reached up slowly and removed his hat, a battered felt Stetson that had seen him through more years than he cared to count. The hat was more than just a covering for his head. It had been his companion through rain and sun, through the worst moments of his life and the few good ones. The brim was worn soft, the crown shaped by his own hands, and there was a small hole on one side where a spark from a campfire had burned through years ago. He held the hat in his left hand, letting Diablo see it clearly. The horse's circling slowed, his attention fixed on the hat, and for a moment, the fear in his eyes was replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint echo of trust that had been beaten out of him by too many rough hands. "That's right," Silas murmured. "Just a hat. Nothing to hurt you, just a piece of felt and sweat." He took another step forward, and this time Diablo held his ground. The horse's body remained tense, ready to bolt, but he did not bolt. Silas moved closer, angling always to the right, keeping himself in that field of vision where the horse seemed more comfortable. Step by step, breath by breath, closing the distance. When he was 10 feet away, Diablo's nerve broke. The horse reared, not in attack but in panic, his front hooves pawing the air. The crowd gasped. Silas heard the metallic click of Sheriff Brennan raising his rifle, heard Cyrus Webb shout something, but he did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hat still held loosely in his hand, and waited for the horse to come back down. Diablo landed hard, his hooves throwing up dust. He backed away, snorting, his whole body trembling. But again, he had not struck, had not tried to hurt. That told Silas everything he needed to know about the nature of this animal's so-called viciousness. "Put the rifle down, Sheriff," Silas called out, never taking his eyes off the horse. "He's not attacking, he's terrified." "Looks pretty damn aggressive to me," Webb shot back. "There's a difference between aggression and fear," Silas replied, "and I'm seeing fear." He began again, the same patient approach, the same slow steps. This time he started talking about something else, about a horse he had once known, a mare with a kind eye and a gentle disposition, who had taught him that patience was the greatest tool any horseman could possess. He told the story to Diablo as if the horse could understand every word, and perhaps in some way he could. Animals responded to tone, to intention, to the quality of presence a person brought to them. Another 5 minutes passed, then 10. Silas was close enough now to see the horse clearly, close enough to confirm what he had suspected. The left eye was not cloudiness, it was older damage, scar tissue that suggested an injury long healed, but permanently disabling. Diablo was blind in that eye, or close to it. And every time someone had approached him from that side, he had panicked because he could not see the threat coming. 3 years of being called a killer, 3 years of rough handling and fear. And the whole time, the answer had been something so simple, so addressable, that it broke Silas's heart. He was now close enough to reach out and touch the horse, but he did not yet. Instead, he did something that would seem strange to everyone watching, but felt exactly right to him. He slowly, carefully, raised his hat and held it up beside his own left side, creating a shadow that blocked his peripheral vision on that side. Then he turned his head, trying to see to his left, and found his vision obscured by the brim. "Can't see a thing," he murmured to the horse. "Can't see what's coming. That would be terrifying, wouldn't it?" And then, with a gentleness born of understanding, Silas Thorne took the final steps that would change everything. Silas moved to Diablo's right side, keeping his approach gradual and visible. The horse tracked him with his good eye, the tension in his body easing by small degrees. When Silas was close enough that he could have reached out and touched the sleek black shoulder, he stopped. He stood there, breathing quietly, letting the horse grow accustomed to his presence in this intimate space. "I'm going to do something now," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I need you to trust me. Just for a moment. Can you do that?" The horse's ear flicked toward him. Silas took that as answer enough. Moving with extreme care, he raised his battered hat and slowly, gently, placed it over the horse's left eye. He did not touch Diablo's head, did not try to make contact with skin. The hat simply rested against the side of the horse's face, blocking the blind eye, creating a darkness where before there had been useless, frightening blankness. For 3 heartbeats nothing happened. The crowd held its collective breath. Sheriff Brennan's finger tightened on the trigger, ready to fire if the horse went berserk. Then Diablo's entire body changed. The rigid tension that had defined every line of him melted away like snow in spring sunshine. His head dropped. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, slowed and deepened. The white had disappeared from around his visible eye, replaced by a soft darkness that suggested relief so profound it was almost like watching pain leave a man's face after a doctor finally removes an arrow he has carried for years. The horse made a sound low, almost mournful, and leaned his head slightly toward the hat, toward the blessed darkness that freed him from the terror of not knowing what approached from his blind side. "Dear God," Doc Henley breathed from outside the fence. The man was right. Silas held the hat in place with his left hand, and with his right, he reached out and rested his palm against Diablo's neck. The horse trembled under his touch, but did not pull away. Silas could feel the rapid pulse beneath the hot skin, could feel the fine quivering of muscles that had been tensed for so long they had forgotten how to relax. "I know," Silas murmured, stroking gently. "I know it's been hard. All those people coming at you, and you couldn't see them, couldn't understand what they wanted. You were just trying to protect yourself." He continued the gentle stroking, his hand moving in slow circles on the horse's neck. With each pass, Diablo's breathing slowed further. The horse's head dropped lower, until his nose was nearly touching the ground, a posture of complete submission and trust that no one in Dust Creek had ever seen from the animal they called Diablo. Silas turned his head to look at the crowd. Every face was frozen in shock. Cyrus Webb's mouth hung open. Sheriff Brennan had lowered his rifle, the weapon dangling forgotten from his hands. Martha Keene had tears running down her cheeks. And Billy, young Billy with his stable hand's intuition, stood with his fists clenched and a look of fierce vindication on his freckled face. "This horse is blind in his left eye," Silas called out, his voice carrying clear in the stunned silence. "Has been for some time, from the looks of that scarring. Every time someone approached him from that side, he panicked because he couldn't see what was coming. It wasn't viciousness, it wasn't a twisted nature, it was fear, pure and simple. And every rough handler who tried to break him only made it worse, because they read his fear as aggression and responded with force." He let that sink in for a moment, watching the realization dawn on face after face in the crowd. Some looked ashamed, others looked angry, though whether that anger was directed at themselves or at the situation was unclear. Cyrus Webb's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on something that might have been regret mixed with stubborn pride. "That doesn't change what he did," Webb said finally, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. 12 men hurt, some of them badly. 12 men who came at him from his blind side without understanding what they were doing, Silas replied. "How many times have you been startled by someone you didn't hear coming? Now imagine being startled like that by people trying to throw ropes on you, saddle you, break you to their will. Imagine it happening over and over, and no matter how much you tried to show them there was something wrong, they just kept coming." Doc Henley had climbed over the corral fence, an impressive feat for a man his age, and was approaching carefully from the right side. Silas nodded to him, and the doctor came close enough to examine the damaged eye. "Scar tissue across the cornea," Doc said after a moment. "Old injury, probably several years old, maybe from a fight with another stallion, maybe from running through brush, hard to say, but the damage is extensive. I'd be surprised if he has any useful vision from this eye at all." He straightened, shaking his head. "We should have seen this. I should have insisted on a proper examination before it came to this." "You couldn't get close enough to examine him," Sheriff Brennan pointed out, finally finding his voice. "None of us could, because we were all approaching him wrong," Billy said, speaking up for the first time. He climbed over the fence and walked directly to Diablo's right side, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this many times. The horse's good eye tracked him, but there was no panic, no tension. Billy reached up and scratched behind Diablo's ear, and the horse actually leaned into the touch. "I've been telling you all for 2 years there was something different about him," Billy said, and there was no anger in his voice, only sadness. But nobody wanted to listen to the stable boy. Martha Keene had made her way to the fence, her hands gripping the rail. "What happens now?" she asked, looking at Silas. "Can anything be done for him?" Silas was quiet for a moment, thinking. The hat still covered Diablo's blind eye, and the horse stood quiet under his hand, finally at peace. But a hat was a temporary solution. The horse needed something more permanent, something that would allow him to live without constant fear. "There's a way," Silas said slowly. "A special bridle can be made, one with a blinder fitted just for his left side. It would do what the hat's doing now, block that useless eye, eliminate the anxiety of not being able to see threats. Horses work well with blinders. Carriage horses wear them all the time to keep them from spooking at side movements." "I can make that," Billy said immediately. "I've worked leather since I was 10 years old. My daddy was a saddle maker before he passed. I know how to fit a custom piece." Cyrus Webb had been silent through this exchange, his face unreadable. Finally, he stepped forward to the fence, looking at the horse he had bought 3 years ago with such high hopes. "He really ain't mean?" Webb asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. "No, sir," Silas replied. "He's just been terribly frightened and poorly understood. But with the right handling, with the right equipment, I believe this horse could be everything you hoped he would be when you bought him." Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Make the bridle," he said to Billy. "And Silas, I'd be obliged if you'd stay on for a while, help train him properly. I'll pay fair wages." It was as close to an apology as a man like Cyrus Webb was likely to come, and Silas recognized it as such. The days that followed brought changes to Dust Creek that went deeper than anyone had anticipated. Silas moved his few belongings from Martha Keene's boarding house to a small room in the Webb Ranch bunkhouse, and began the slow work of rebuilding trust with a horse that had learned to expect only fear and pain from human hands. Billy threw himself into crafting the custom bridle with the focused intensity of someone who had finally been given a chance to prove his worth. He worked in the tack room of the barn, his father's old leather tools spread before him, an array of punches, needles, and edges that had been lovingly maintained through years of use. The tools themselves told a story, handles worn smooth by a craftsman's grip, blades kept sharp and clean, each piece bearing the small marks and scratches that came from a lifetime of skilled work. Billy measured Diablo's head carefully, from multiple angles, approaching always from the right side, speaking softly to the horse as he worked. The measurements had to be precise. Too tight, and the bridle would cause discomfort; too loose, and it would not serve its purpose. He sketched designs on scraps of paper, trying different configurations of the blinder, considering how it would sit against the damaged eye without causing pressure on the scar tissue. Silas watched the boy work and saw something familiar, the same careful attention to detail, the same respect for craft that he had once brought to his own work in another life. It stirred memories he usually kept locked away, of a time when he had been a different man with different responsibilities. He pushed those memories down, as he always did, and focused on the present. The training sessions with Diablo were slow and methodical. Each morning, Silas would enter the corral and simply stand with the horse, allowing the animal to grow accustomed to his presence. He learned the language of Diablo's body, the way his ears would flick to signal attention or concern, the subtle shifts in weight that indicated relaxation or tension, the soft, huffing breaths that meant contentment. On the third day, Doc Henley came out to the ranch to conduct a proper examination. With Silas holding his hat over the horse's blind eye and Billy standing at Diablo's head speaking gentle reassurances, the doctor was able to check the animal thoroughly. What he found confirmed their theories. "The eye is completely non-functional," Doc reported, cleaning his spectacles with a handkerchief. "The scar tissue is dense. There's no pain, mind you, the injury healed cleanly enough. But vision from that side would be like looking through wax paper. If there's any vision at all, the horse has been navigating the world half-blind for years." "Could the eye be removed?" Cyrus Webb asked. He had taken to attending the training sessions, watching from outside the corral with an expression that mixed fascination and shame in equal measures. "It could," Doc replied, "but it would be a significant surgery, with risk of infection and complications, and it wouldn't accomplish anything the custom bridle won't. The eye itself isn't causing pain or problems, it's the confusion and fear from the partial vision that's the issue. Block that completely, and the horse should do fine." That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Silas sat on the bunkhouse steps, watching the horses in the distant pastures. Martha Keene had brought out a basket of food, fresh bread, cold chicken, and apple pie, more than Silas could eat in 2 meals. She sat beside him, her presence comfortable and undemanding. "You've given that boy something important," she said after a while. "Billy, I mean. He's been walking taller this week than I've seen in the 2 years since his father died." "He's the one who saw the truth," Silas replied. "I just listened to him. Most men wouldn't have. Most men would have dismissed what a 17-year-old stable hand had to say." Silas was quiet for a moment, turning over a piece of bread in his hands. "I knew someone once who made the mistake of not listening to someone young. Thought, experience, and age meant he knew better. He was wrong, and people paid for that mistake." Martha looked at him thoughtfully. "You don't talk much about your past." "No," Silas agreed. "I don't." She did not press, which was one of the things he appreciated about her. She simply nodded and changed the subject to the upcoming church social, the new family that had moved into town, the small gossip and news that made up the fabric of community life. Silas listened, responding when appropriate, and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sense of belonging he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. By the end of the week, Billy had completed the custom bridle. He presented it to Silas and Cyrus Webb with quiet pride, and rightfully so. The craftsmanship was exceptional. The bridle was made of supple leather, dyed a rich brown that would complement Diablo's black coat. The blinder for the left side was ingeniously designed, shaped to cup over the damaged eye without touching the scar tissue, attached with small brass rings that allowed for adjustment and lined with soft flannel to prevent rubbing. "Your father would be proud," Silas told Billy, and the boy's face lit up with pleasure. Fitting the bridle to Diablo was a delicate process. The horse had been handled roughly with tack before, forced into bits and bridles by men who had no patience for his fear. Silas took his time, showing the horse each piece of the bridle, letting him smell the leather, allowing him to understand that this was different. Billy stood ready with sugar cubes, a treat he had been using to build positive associations, and offered them at each stage of the process. First, the bit, which Diablo accepted after only a moment's hesitation. Then the headstall, slipped over his ears with gentle hands. Finally, the custom blinder, positioned carefully over the blind eye. The effect was immediate and profound, with the useless eye completely blocked, eliminating the confusion of partial vision. Diablo's entire demeanor shifted. The constant state of vigilance that had defined him melted away. His head dropped to a natural, relaxed position. His breathing deepened. When Silas stepped to his left side, the side that had always triggered panic, the horse simply turned his head slightly to track the movement with his good eye, but showed no fear. "Lord, have mercy," Cyrus Webb breathed, watching from the fence. "It's like having a completely different animal." "It's the same animal," Silas corrected gently. "He's just finally able to understand the world around him without fear." Over the next days, Silas progressed through the basic training steps that should have been completed years ago. He taught Diablo to accept a saddle, to tolerate weight on his back, to respond to gentle pressure from legs and reins. The horse learned quickly, as if making up for lost time, and his intelligence became apparent. This was not a stupid or stubborn animal. This was a creature who had been trapped in a nightmare of his own limited perception, and now, freed from that nightmare, was eager to engage with the world on new terms. By the end of the second week, Silas was riding Diablo around the corral at a walk, then a trot, and finally a canter. The horse moved with a grace and power that took everyone's breath away. This was the animal Cyrus Webb had envisioned when he bought him, strong, intelligent, with bloodlines that spoke of generations of careful breeding. But even as progress accelerated, Silas felt old shadows stirring. The success with Diablo had made Silas something of a local celebrity, a status that sat uneasily on his shoulders. People in town, who had previously barely noticed him, now stopped to talk, asked his opinion on their own horses, invited him to Sunday dinners. He accepted the attention with polite gratitude, but kept his guard up, wary of the expectations that came with being seen as someone special. It was Sheriff Brennan who first asked the question that others had been too polite to voice. He found Silas in town one afternoon, purchasing supplies at the general store, and walked him outside into the dusty street. "You've got skills with horses that go beyond just understanding them," Brennan said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "The way you moved in that corral, the way you read that animal, that's military training if I ever saw it." "Cavalry?" Silas felt his shoulders tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "I've done various work over the years." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I'm giving." Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Every man's entitled to his past staying past. I just wanted you to know, if you ever need to talk about anything, my door's open. I've seen enough men carrying weight they don't speak of to recognize it when I see it again." After the sheriff walked away, Silas stood in the street for a long moment, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever anyone got too close to the walls he had built. That night, Alone in his bunkhouse room, he took from his saddlebag the one item he allowed himself to keep from his former life, a tintype photograph. The image faded to shades of grey and sepia. The photograph showed three people, a younger version of himself in cavalry uniform, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and a boy of perhaps 8 years old, standing between them. The boy had his mother's smile and his father's serious eyes. Silas traced the outline of those faces with a finger worn rough by work and time, allowing himself this rare moment of remembrance. Captain Silas Thorne, they had called him, 3rd Cavalry, stationed at various posts throughout the West during the campaigns against the Apache and the Sioux. He had been good at his job, too good perhaps, efficient, strategic, capable of making hard decisions quickly. He had earned commendations, respect, and the kind of reputation that made younger officers seek his advice. But efficiency in war came with a cost. The hard decisions had consequences that haunted him in quiet moments. The strategies that saved some lives ended others. And the respect he earned felt hollow when measured against the weight of what he carried. The photograph had been taken during the last good year, before everything fell apart, before the campaign that went wrong. Before the young lieutenant, not much older than Billy was, now had come to him with concerns about the planned route through Apache territory. Before Silas, in his arrogance and experience, had dismissed those concerns. Before the ambush that killed 12 men, including that young lieutenant, the official report had exonerated him. The inquiry had found his decisions sound given the information available, but Silas knew better. He had ignored good instincts because they came from someone young and unproven. He had valued his own experience over someone else's observations, and men had died for his pride. 6 months after the inquiry, his wife had succumbed to pneumonia, worn down by the harsh conditions of frontier army life. His son, angry and grieving, had refused to speak to him, blaming him for decisions that had kept them on remote posts far from proper medical care. The boy had gone to live with his mother's sister in Philadelphia, and Silas had let him go, believing his son was better off without him. That was 7 years ago. 7 years of drifting from place to place, working whatever jobs presented themselves, carrying his guilt like stones in his pockets. He had sworn never to take responsibility for others again, never to be in a position where his decisions could cost lives. He had become invisible, unremarkable, just another aging drifter in a territory full of them. Until a black horse had needed someone to listen, until a young, stable hand had needed someone to trust his observations, until Silas had been forced to choose between walking away and stepping forward. He returned the photograph to the oilcloth wrapping and placed it carefully back in his saddlebag. Then he lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if redemption was possible for men like him, or if some mistakes were simply too large to overcome. The next morning brought a new challenge. One of the men Diablo had injured, a rancher named Garrett from 2 counties over, rode into the Webb Ranch with 3 of his hands. Silas was in the corral with the horse when they arrived, working on response to leg pressure, and he felt the shift in Diablo's mood immediately. The horse's head came up, his body tensing, and Silas realized the animal recognized Garrett's voice. "That, the devil horse," Garrett called out, his voice carrying harsh across the morning air. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders, with a florid face and hands like hams. "I heard Webb was training him up, heard some drifter worked a miracle." Cyrus Webb had emerged from the house. "Morning, Garrett. What brings you out this way?" "Curiosity, mostly. That horse broke 3 of my ribs and gave me a concussion that had me seeing double for a month. Cost me 2 weeks of work and a hell of a lot of pain. Now I hear he's gentle as a lamb." Garrett's tone held disbelief and something darker anger that someone else had succeeded where he had failed. Silas dismounted slowly, keeping his body between Garrett and Diablo. The horse was trembling, his ears pinned back, and Silas could feel the fear rising in him. This was a voice associated with pain, with rough handling, with the time before anyone understood what was wrong. "The horse has a medical condition," Silas said calmly. "He's blind in one eye." Once that was addressed with proper equipment, his behavior changed completely. "Blind," Garrett snorted. "That's your excuse? I've worked with half-blind horses before, never had one try to kill me. With respect, sir, you probably worked with horses who had lost vision gradually and learned to compensate. Or horses who had people working with them who understood their limitation. Diablo had sudden vision loss from an injury, was handled by people who didn't know about it, and responded to that handling with fear. What looked like viciousness was panic." Garrett swung down from his horse and walked toward the corral fence. His movements were aggressive, his body language threatening, and Diablo's panic spiked. The horse reared slightly, pulling against Silas's hold on the reins, and Silas had to work to calm him. "Still looks vicious to me," Garrett said with satisfaction. "He's responding to your energy," Silas replied, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "You're projecting aggression, and he's reacting to it. Same as any creature would react to a perceived threat. You saying, 'I'm the problem'? I'm saying that approaching any animal with hostility will generally get you hostility in return." The confrontation might have escalated, but Martha Keene's wagon came rattling up the ranch road at that moment, and her presence seemed to diffuse some of the tension. She climbed down with a basket of food and a no-nonsense expression that had silenced more than one argument in Dust Creek. "Gentlemen," Martha said briskly, "if you're going to stand around jawing, you might as well do it with fresh coffee and biscuits in your bellies. I didn't drive all the way out here to watch a display of masculine posturing." The tension broke, as she had intended. Garrett's men actually smiled, and even Garrett himself seemed to deflate slightly under Martha's practical gaze. The group moved toward the main house, leaving Silas alone with Diablo in the corral. He spent the next hour working with the horse, rebuilding the calm that Garrett's presence had disrupted. By the time Cyrus Webb came to find him, Diablo was relaxed again, responding smoothly to commands, his blind side protected by the custom bridle that had given him back his confidence. "Garrett's gone," Webb said, leaning on the corral fence. "But before he left, he told me something interesting, something I think you should know." Silas felt a prickle of unease. "What's that?" He asked where I got Diablo. When I told him Mexico, from a dealer who claimed Spanish bloodlines, he laughed. Said he knew that dealer. Said the man's a fraud who buys up problem horses cheap and sells them with fake papers to gullible buyers. Webb's expression was serious. Garrett said Diablo wasn't from any Spanish breeding line. Said the horse was probably stolen from an Apache village during one of the campaigns, and that's how he got the injury to his eye. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He stood very still, his hand resting on Diablo's neck, feeling the world shift around him. "Apache," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. That's what Garrett said. Apparently the army's been confiscating horses from Apache villages for years, part of breaking their ability to raid and move quickly. Some of those horses end up sold to dealers, who then resell them. If Diablo came from an Apache herd, the eye injury could have happened during the capture, running through rough country trying to escape, maybe getting hit by something during the raid itself. Webb continued talking, but Silas had stopped hearing him. His mind was racing backward through time to a series of raids 7 years ago in Arizona territory. He had commanded 2 of those raids himself, operations designed to capture horses and disrupt Apache mobility. The raids had been considered successful by military standards. They had taken hundreds of horses, weakened the Apache ability to hunt and travel, and done so with minimal casualties. But Silas remembered something else now, something he had pushed into the back of his memory, where he kept all the things that troubled his sleep. During one of those raids, there had been a black colt, maybe 2 years old, already showing the powerful build and intelligent eyes that promised to be an exceptional horse. The colt had been with a small band that scattered when the cavalry approached. In the chaos of the capture, Silas had seen the young horse running frantically, had heard the sound of it crashing through brush in its panic to escape. They had caught the colt eventually, added it to the others being driven to the holding corrals. And Silas had noticed, in the brief moment he looked at the captured animals, that the young black horse had blood trickling from somewhere around its head. He had made a note to have the injury checked, but then the campaign had continued, and there had been other priorities, and he had forgotten about one frightened colt among hundreds of captured horses. Could Diablo be that same horse? The timing was right. 7 years ago, the colt would have been 2 or 3 years old, making him 9 or 10 now, which matched Diablo's age. The injury to the left eye would have been fresh then, probably contaminated by dirt and debris during the panicked run, explaining the severe scarring that had resulted in blindness. Silas, Webb's voice cut through his thoughts. You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. I might have, Silas said quietly. He took a breath, steadying himself. 7 years ago, I was part of the campaigns against the Apache cavalry. I commanded raids to capture horses from their villages. Webb's eyes widened. You never said you were military. I don't talk about it much, but I remember there was a black colt, young, strong. We took him during a raid. He was injured in the capture, something around his head. I noticed it, meant to have it checked, but he stopped, unable to continue for a moment. I was focused on the larger mission. One injured colt didn't seem important in the scheme of things. The weight of realization settled over both men. If Diablo was indeed that same horse, then the chain of events became horrifyingly clear. The injury that had caused the blindness had happened during a cavalry raid Silas himself had commanded. The horse had been traumatized by the violent capture, injured in the chaos, then processed through military corrals where overworked soldiers had probably missed or ignored the eye injury. Eventually, he had been sold off through dealers who cared nothing for his welfare, ending up with false papers in Mexico, and finally purchased by Cyrus Webb with dreams of breeding stock. And all those years, the horse had carried the physical and psychological scars of that single day when his world had been torn apart by men in blue uniforms conducting what they considered necessary military operations. Lord have mercy, Webb breathed. If that's true, if this horse's whole nightmare started with a cavalry raid you commanded, then I'm as responsible for what happened to him as anyone. Silas finished. The bitter irony was not lost on him. He had come to Dust Creek running from his past, trying to escape the weight of decisions that had cost lives. And here, in a corral in Arizona territory, his past had found him anyway, wearing a different face but carrying the same message. Your choices have consequences, even when you don't see them, even when you convince yourself they don't matter. He had saved this horse, yes, but only after being part of the system that had broken him in the first place. Billy appeared at the corral, his young face bright with excitement, unaware of the heavy conversation that had just occurred. Mr. Thorne, I was hoping I could try riding Diablo today. You said when he was ready, I could. He stopped, seeing the expressions on the two men's faces. What's wrong? Silas looked at the boy, then at the horse standing calm and trusting under his hand, then back at Billy. This young man who had seen what others missed, who had believed in the possibility of understanding rather than condemnation, who represented everything Silas wished he had been at that age. Nothing's wrong, Silas said, and found he could smile despite the turmoil in his chest. You're right. Diablo's ready. Let's get you on him. Because that was the other truth, the one that stood alongside the guilt. You could not undo the past, could not erase the consequences of your decisions, but you could choose, in the present moment, to act differently, to listen instead of dismiss, to understand instead of condemn, to give a second chance to someone, whether horse or human, who had been judged without being truly seen. Cyrus Webb watched as Silas helped Billy into the saddle, watched as the boy who had been dismissed as just a stable hand guided the horse that had been condemned as irredeemable around the corral with growing confidence. And Cyrus found himself thinking about his own role in this story, how quickly he had given up on the animal, how eager he had been to resort to execution rather than investigation. They all had blood on their hands, he realized. The difference was what they chose to do with that knowledge. As the afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the ranch, the three men worked together, teaching, learning, building something new from the broken pieces of what had come before. It was not redemption, not exactly, but it was a start. Word of Diablo's transformation had spread beyond Dust Creek, carried by travelers and merchants to neighboring towns and settlements. The story had taken on a life of its own, the killer horse that turned out to be blind and afraid, the mysterious drifter who had seen what no one else could, the young, stable hand whose observations had been proven right. It was the kind of story people liked to tell, especially in a territory where good news was often scarce. 2 weeks after Garrett's visit, a letter arrived at the Webb Ranch from Fort Bridger. Colonel Marcus Henshaw, the fort's commanding officer, had heard about the horse and the unusual training methods that had been employed. He was interested in seeing a demonstration. More than that, he was interested in discussing a potential contract for Cyrus Webb to supply cavalry horses using these new understanding-based training techniques. Could be significant money. Webb told Silas, waving the letter. The army's always looking for better ways to train horses. If we can show them that understanding an animal's limitations and working with them rather than against them produces better results, they might be willing to pay premium prices for horses trained using these methods. Silas felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of the army, but he pushed it aside. When does the colonel want this demonstration? He's proposing to visit in 2 weeks' time, bring some of his officers, maybe a few other ranchers who supply the fort, make it a proper showing. Webb's excitement was palpable. This could change everything for the ranch. For the whole town, really. We could become known as the place that revolutionized horse training. Billy, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. Mr. Thorne, you think Diablo's ready for that, being around a lot of people, especially military men? It was a good question, showing the boy's growing understanding of horses and their needs. Silas considered it carefully. He's come a long way, Silas said, but you're right to be concerned. A demonstration with a crowd watching, soldiers in uniform that could trigger old fears. We'll need to prepare him carefully. Over the next days, Silas implemented a systematic desensitization program. He had Billy and some of the ranch hands dress in clothing that resembled cavalry uniforms, blue shirts, darker pants. He had them walk around the corral while he worked with Diablo, getting the horse accustomed to seeing those colors and shapes without associating them with trauma. The horse showed anxiety at first, his body tensing, his breathing quickening. But with the custom blinder protecting his blind side, and with Silas's calm presence reassuring him, Diablo gradually learned that these blue-clothed figures were not threats. It was slow work, requiring patience and repetition. But Silas had learned long ago that the best training could not be rushed. Martha Keene had taken it upon herself to organize the logistics of the demonstration. She coordinated with the fort about timing, arranged for extra provisions to feed the visiting delegation, and even convinced several of the town's ladies to prepare a meal that would be served after the showing. Her efficiency and organizational skills impressed everyone, including Silas. "You could have run a military campaign," he told her one evening as she reviewed her lists of tasks and supplies. "I've run a boarding house for 15 years. She replied with a slight smile. "That requires many of the same skills, logistics, supply management, handling difficult personalities. The main difference is that I don't have to shoot anyone." As the date of the demonstration approached, Silas found himself grappling with emotions he had thought long buried. The prospect of facing army officers again, of being in that world even tangentially, stirred up memories he had worked hard to suppress. He began having the dreams again, fragments of campaigns, faces of men he had commanded, the sound of gunfire echoing across desert valleys. One night, Unable to sleep, he walked out to the corral where Diablo was kept. The horse came to the fence when he heard Silas's footsteps, nickering softly in greeting. Silas stood in the darkness, running his hand along the horse's neck, and found himself speaking aloud the thoughts that troubled him. "I was part of what hurt you," he said quietly. "All those years ago, I gave orders that destroyed your life, and I didn't even know it. Didn't care enough to know it. You were just one horse among many, one small consequence of a larger strategy." Diablo stood quietly, his breath warm in the cool night air. The stars overhead were brilliant, as they always were in the high desert country, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called. "I can't undo what was done," Silas continued. "Can't give you back those years of fear and confusion. But maybe I can make sure that what we show these officers next week actually changes something. Maybe I can convince them that there's a better way, that understanding beats force every time." The horse leaned his head over the fence, and Silas rested his forehead against the broad nose, taking comfort in the simple presence of this animal he had helped to save. Doc Henley found him there an hour later. The old doctor had been making his evening rounds and had seen the figure by the corral. "Couldn't sleep?" Doc asked, coming to stand beside Silas. "Too much thinking." "That'll do it." Doc was quiet for a moment, then said, "Martha told me about the letter from Fort Bridger. Army officers coming to watch. That must bring back memories. Some I'd rather not have brought back. The past has a way of finding us, doesn't it? No matter how far we run." Doc cleaned his spectacles, a habitual gesture. "I was a field surgeon during the war. Saw things that still visit me some nights. All those young men, boys, really torn apart by bullets and bayonets. I saved some, lost more. For a long time, I couldn't forgive myself for the ones I lost." Silas looked at him with new understanding. "What changed?" "I realized that guilt was just another form of pride. I was assuming I had more control over outcomes than I actually did. War is chaos. Medicine is imperfect. We do our best with the knowledge we have at the time, and we accept that our best isn't always enough." He replaced his spectacles. "Doesn't mean we don't carry the weight, just means we learn to carry it without letting it crush us." They stood together in the darkness, two men who had seen too much and were trying to build something better from the ruins of their regrets. The week before the demonstration brought a flurry of activity. Billy worked on creating a second custom bridle as a backup, his leatherwork having improved significantly through practice. Cyrus Webb had the corral rails reinforced and painted, wanting everything to look professional. Martha coordinated the meal preparations with the kind of precision that would have impressed a quartermaster. And Silas trained. He worked with Diablo every day, sometimes for hours at a stretch, refining the communication between them until it became almost telepathic. He taught the horse to respond to the lightest touch of rein or leg, to shift from walk to trot to canter with barely perceptible cues. He practiced mounting and dismounting from both sides, showing that the horse was comfortable with approach from any direction as long as his blind side was properly protected. Sheriff Brennan came out to watch one of the training sessions, and afterward he pulled Silas aside. "I made some inquiries," Brennan said. "Asked around about cavalry officers named Thorne. Found some interesting information about a Captain Silas Thorne, who served with distinction in the Apache campaigns, but resigned his commission 7 years ago after his wife died. Man had a reputation as a brilliant tactician, but carried guilt about an ambush that killed some of his men." Silas said nothing, waiting. "I'm not asking you to confirm or deny," Brennan continued. "I'm just saying whatever you're carrying, whatever brought you to Dust Creek, you've done good here. That counts for something." "Does it count enough?" Silas asked quietly. "Maybe, maybe not. But it's more than most men manage." Brennan tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Silas to consider his words. The night before the demonstration, the ranch hosted a small gathering, just the core group of people who had been involved in Diablo's transformation. Martha brought food. Doc Henley brought whiskey, which he claimed was for medicinal purposes. Billy brought his father's old fiddle and played a few tunes. his playing unpracticed but heartfelt. Cyrus Webb, who had paid for most of this and stood to gain or lose the most from tomorrow's showing, raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said, "for horses and for men." They drank to that, and in the silence that followed, Silas felt something shift inside him. Not absolution, he was not fool enough to believe his guilt could be so easily washed away, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance, the first step toward believing that a man could be defined by more than his worst moments. Tomorrow would bring the officers from Fort Bridger. Tomorrow would bring the test of whether all this work, all this hope, could translate into something larger than one horse's transformation. Tomorrow would determine if understanding and patience could compete with the brutal efficiency of force and fear. But tonight, surrounded by people who had become something like family, watching Billy play his father's fiddle while Martha smiled, and Doc tapped his foot, and Cyrus allowed himself to hope, Silas Thorne felt something he had not felt in 7 years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could forgive himself enough to move forward. Colonel Marcus Henshaw arrived at precisely 9 o'clock on a morning so clear you could see the mountains 50 miles away. He came with an entourage, 3 junior officers, 2 civilian contractors who supplied horses to the fort, and a sergeant who had spent 20 years breaking cavalry mounts the traditional way. They rode in on military-issue horses, their blue uniforms crisp despite the dust of travel, and their bearing carried the unmistakable stamp of career soldiers. Silas stood near the corral, watching them approach, and felt the past and present collide. He had worn that same uniform once, had sat a horse with that same rigid posture, had believed in the righteousness of military efficiency. Now, standing in civilian clothes with dust on his boots and grey in his hair, he felt the distance between who he had been and who he had become. The colonel dismounted and approached Cyrus Webb with his hand extended. Henshaw was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with keen grey eyes that missed nothing. He had the look of a man who had spent his life in service and wore that service like a second skin. "Mr. Webb, pleasure to meet you. Your letter intrigued me considerably." "Colonel Henshaw, welcome. This is Silas Thorne, the man who's done the actual work with the horse." Henshaw turned those sharp eyes on Silas, and for a moment something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or curiosity. He extended his hand, and Silas shook it, noting the firm grip and assessing gaze. "Mr. Thorne, I've been in the cavalry business for 30 years, and I've never heard of anyone taming a confirmed killer horse with nothing but patience and a custom bridle. I'm skeptical, but I'm willing to be convinced." "Skepticism is fair," Silas replied, "but the horse was never a killer. He was frightened and misunderstood. There's a difference." A crowd had gathered. Most of Dust Creek had turned out to watch. Along with ranchers from neighboring spreads who had heard about the demonstration, Sheriff Brennan maintained order, keeping people back from the corral but allowing them to see clearly. Martha and the other ladies had set up tables with refreshments, and the whole thing had taken on the atmosphere of a county fair. Billy led Diablo from his stable to the corral. The horse wore his custom bridle, the leather gleaming from fresh oil, the blinder fitted perfectly over his damaged eye. He moved with calm confidence, his head low and relaxed, following Billy with the trust of an animal who had finally learned that humans could mean safety rather than threat. The military men watched with interest. The old sergeant, a man named Collins with weathered features and skeptical eyes, shook his head. "That's Diablo," Collins said. "I heard about him. Heard he broke more bones than any horse in 3 territories. Doesn't look like much now." "That's because he's not terrified anymore," Billy said, his young voice carrying unexpected authority. "He was blind in one eye. Nobody knew it. So everybody who tried to work with him approached from his blind side. He couldn't see them coming, so he panicked." Collins studied the horse more carefully. "Blind, you say? And that contraption on his head that's blocking the bad eye?" "Yes, sir. Once he could stop worrying about threats he couldn't see, he became exactly what you see now, calm, trainable, responsive." Colonel Henshaw walked closer to the corral fence, his eyes moving between the horse and Silas. "I'd like to see him work, not just walk around a corral. I want to see how he handles stress, unexpected movements, the kind of situations a cavalry mount would face." "That's why we're here," Silas said. He entered the corral, and Diablo immediately turned his head to track the movement, his one good eye bright and alert, but showing no fear. Silas approached from the right side, as always, and the horse nickered softly in greeting. The transformation from the terrified, aggressive animal of 3 weeks ago was so complete it seemed almost miraculous. Silas swung into the saddle in one smooth motion, settling his weight carefully. Diablo stood steady, his ears forward, waiting for direction. Silas gathered the reins and began. He started with the basics: walk, trot, canter, demonstrating the horse's responsiveness to subtle cues. Then he moved to more complex maneuvers, figure eights at a canter, flying lead changes, backing in a straight line. Diablo performed flawlessly, his powerful body moving with grace and precision, his blind side no longer a source of panic, but simply a fact of his existence, managed and accommodated. The military men watched in silence. Even the skeptical Sergeant Collins had nothing to say. Then Silas did something that made the crowd gasp. He dismounted while Diablo was still moving at a trot, hit the ground running, sprinted to the horse's left side, the blind side, and vaulted back into the saddle from that direction. Diablo never broke stride, never panicked, simply continued his smooth trot around the corral. It was a dramatic demonstration of trust and training, and it had exactly the effect Silas had intended. The message was clear. This horse was not dangerous. This horse was exceptional, and with the right understanding and equipment, he could be what he was always meant to be. Colonel Henshaw signaled for Silas to bring the horse to a stop. Silas did so, and Diablo stood quiet in the center of the corral, his sides barely heaving despite the workout, his eye calm and bright. "Remarkable," Henshaw said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. "But I need to see how he handles chaos. Sergeant Collins, if you would." Collins nodded and gestured to the 2 junior officers. They retrieved items from their saddlebags, pieces of canvas that could be flapped, a wooden rattle that made sharp noise, even a bugle. The old sergeant knew from experience that cavalry horses needed to handle battlefield conditions: gunfire, shouting, sudden movements, chaos on all sides. "May I?" Collins asked, holding up the items. Silas felt his heart rate increase but kept his voice steady. "Go ahead, but approach from his right side where he can see you. Let him know what's coming." Collins entered the corral and walked to Diablo's right, moving slowly, speaking in a low voice. He showed the horse each item, letting him sniff it, see it. Then, with Silas still mounted, he began the tests. First, he flapped the canvas, a sharp snapping sound that made several horses tied nearby jump. Diablo's ears flicked back, and Silas felt the horse's muscles tense, but the animal held steady. Silas stroked his neck, murmuring reassurance, and after a moment, Diablo relaxed. Next, Collins rattled the wooden noisemaker. The harsh clacking was jarring, intentionally so. Diablo danced sideways but did not bolt, did not panic. Silas let him move, gave him space to process the sound, then gently brought him back to center. Finally, Collins lifted the bugle and blew a cavalry call to charge. The sharp, brassy notes cut through the morning air, and for a moment Silas felt Diablo gather beneath him, every muscle coiling. The horse remembered something in that sound, some deep association with chaos and fear from his past. But Silas sat deep in the saddle, his hands steady on the reins, his weight and presence communicating safety, and after 3 thundering heartbeats, Diablo settled. The crowd erupted in applause. Even the military men were impressed, though they tried to maintain their professional demeanor. Colonel Henshaw climbed over the fence and approached Diablo directly, this time from the horse's right side. He studied the custom bridle, examining how the blinder was attached, how it fit against the scarred eye. "This is ingenious," he said. "Simple, but ingenious." How many horses in the army might benefit from something similar? How many animals have we written off as untrainable when the real issue was a physical problem we never diagnosed? He turned to Silas. The army needs better horse trainers, Mr. Thorne. Men who think like you do, who look for reasons rather than just trying to break an animal's will. I'd like to offer you a position as a civilian contractor. You'd travel to various posts, assess problem horses, train our sergeants in these methods. The pay would be generous. For a moment, Silas was tempted. It was a chance to make a real difference, to change how the military handled horses, to prevent other animals from suffering as Diablo had suffered. But it was also a return to that world, to the structure and hierarchy and weight of command that he had fled from. I'm honored, Colonel, Silas said carefully, but I'm not the man for that job. I'm just a drifter who happened to listen to a stable boy's observations. Henshaw's sharp eyes studied him. You're more than that, I think, but I won't press. He turned to Billy. What about you, son? You made the bridle. You were the one who first noticed the horse's behavior patterns. Would you be interested in such work? Billy's eyes went wide. Me? But I'm not trained or... You're observant, Henshaw interrupted. You're patient. You care about the animals. That's more valuable than formal training. I could arrange for you to apprentice at Fort Bridger, learn from our best horsemen, then travel to other posts to teach what you've learned here. The boy looked at Silas, uncertainty and hope warring on his young face. It's a good opportunity, Silas said gently. Your father would be proud. Billy straightened his shoulders. Yes, sir, Colonel. I'd be honored to accept. Henshaw nodded with satisfaction. Good man. He turned to Cyrus Webb. And you, Mr. Webb, I'm prepared to offer a contract for 20 horses a year, trained using these methods. Each horse will need to pass tests similar to what we just witnessed. The price per horse will be double our standard rate. Webb tried to maintain his composure, but failed to hide his elation. That's more than generous, Colonel. It's practical, Henshaw corrected. A well-trained horse is worth twice what a barely broken one is. And a horse trained with understanding rather than force will serve longer and better. This demonstration has convinced me of that. As the military men began discussing contracts and logistics with Webb, as Billy stood taller with his new purpose, as the crowd dispersed with excited chatter about what they had witnessed, Silas dismounted and stood quietly with Diablo. He rested his forehead against the horse's neck and allowed himself a moment of simple gratitude. 3 months after the demonstration, Silas stood at the corral fence in the early morning light, watching Diablo graze peacefully in the pasture beyond. The horse had been moved from the reinforced corral to open range, trusted now to return when called, confident in his place and purpose. His black coat gleamed in the autumn sun, and the custom bridle that had given him back his life hung on a peg in the barn, no longer needed for simple grazing, but ready whenever work required it. The transformation of Dust Creek had been as dramatic as the transformation of the horse. Billy had left for Fort Bridger 2 months ago, and his letters arrived weekly, full of enthusiasm about the horses he was working with and the methods he was teaching to skeptical cavalry sergeants. Cyrus Webb's ranch had become known throughout the territory as a place where horses were trained with patience and understanding, and ranchers came from 3 states over to learn the techniques. The contract with the army had brought prosperity not just to Webb, but to the entire town, as suppliers and craftsmen benefited from the increased business. And Silas had finally stopped running. He had taken a permanent position at the ranch, not as a hired hand, but as a partner in the training operation. Webb had insisted, recognizing that the methods and philosophy Silas brought were as valuable as any financial investment. The small room in the bunkhouse had been replaced with a cottage on the property, modest but comfortable, and for the first time in 7 years, Silas had a place that felt like home. Martha Keene came walking up the path, a basket over her arm containing his breakfast, a courtesy she extended despite his protests that he was capable of cooking for himself. She had become a constant in his life, her practical wisdom and gentle humor a balm to his long-wounded spirit. They had not spoken of the future, had not put names to what was growing between them, but both understood that some things did not need words. "You're up early again," she said, setting the basket on the fence rail. "You keep rancher's hours now." "Old habit. The military trains you to rise before dawn." "The military," she repeated. "You talk about it more now, that's progress." He smiled slightly. "Doc Henley says, talking about things takes away their power over you." "Doc Henley is a wise man." She stood beside him, looking out at the grazing horses. "I got a letter from Billy yesterday. He asked me to thank you again for believing in him. He did the work. I just listened. That's more than most people do." She was quiet for a moment. "Colonel Henshaw wrote to me as well. He asked if I thought you might reconsider his offer not to travel to different posts, but to establish a training school here in Dust Creek, funded by the Army. A place where both horses and handlers could learn better methods." Silas felt something tighten in his chest, but it was not the old panic. It was something closer to possibility. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was your decision to make. But I also told him that I thought you might be ready to stop seeing yourself as a man running from his past and start seeing yourself as a man building a future." He turned to look at her fully, this woman who had offered him a room when he was a stranger, who had defended him when he stepped into danger, who had quietly and steadily become essential to his daily life. "And if that future involves more than just horses?" Her smile was gentle. "Then I'd say, it's about time you figured that out." They stood together in the morning light, not touching but connected by something deeper than physical contact, and Silas felt the last of the weight he had been carrying begin to lift. Later that day, he received his own letter not from the Army, but from Philadelphia. The handwriting was familiar despite the years, and his hands shook slightly as he opened it. His son, now 15 years old, had written to say that he had heard from Colonel Henshaw about what his father had been doing in Arizona Territory. The letter was brief and carefully formal, the words of a young man trying to bridge a gap he was not sure could be bridged. But it ended with a request. Might he visit during the summer, to see the horses, and perhaps to talk? Silas read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the wooden box where he kept his few treasured possessions next to the tintype photograph and the book of Emerson essays, adding to the collection of things that mattered. That evening he rode Diablo out to the overlook, where the land fell away into valley and distance, where a man could see for miles in every direction. The horse moved with easy confidence, his powerful stride eating up ground, his breathing deep and even. When they reached the high point, Silas dismounted and stood looking out at the land stretching before them, harsh and beautiful, unforgiving and full of promise. He had come to Dust Creek with nothing but a worn saddlebag and a lifetime of regret. He had not been looking for redemption, had not believed it was possible, but he had found something better than redemption. He had found purpose. He had found community. He had found that even the worst mistakes did not have to define the rest of a man's life, as long as he was willing to listen, to learn, to choose differently when given the chance. Diablo stood beside him, the horse that had been called a devil but was just frightened, the horse that had been condemned but deserved understanding. They had saved each other, really the man running from his past and the horse trapped in fear. Together, they had proven that patience was stronger than force, that understanding was more powerful than condemnation, that every creature deserved to be truly seen before being judged. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow would bring new horses to train, new people to teach, a letter to write to his son, and perhaps a conversation with Martha about futures and possibilities. But for this moment, Silas simply stood on the overlook with the horse who had taught him that second chances were real, that transformation was possible, and that even the most broken things could be made whole again with enough patience, understanding, and grace. Sometimes we condemn what we don't understand, but when we take the time to truly see, to truly listen, we discover that what we feared was only calling out for help. And in answering that call, we often find that we save ourselves as much as we save what we sought to rescue. The truth had left the town speechless, but the truth had also set them all free.